Now, and you're good to go.
It says that my
Oh,
screen sharing was disabled. Awkward.
Hold on. Hold on, I'll find you. Try now.
There we go. All right. Cool.
I think that's fine.
For both servers, wouldn't you?
Are we good now?
I can see. Can everyone see his screen?
Yes.
Okay.
Cool. Well, welcome to January, everybody. We made it to, if you're doing dry January, I'm sorry you're in this class because this should be a very fluid session here. So yeah, we're gonna, in these 2 hours, we're gonna go the full time because there's just so much information, and hopefully I don't bore anybody. But if you really want to geek out on what we call the dram, this will be the time. Like Brittany said, we're gonna kind of talk a little bit here at the beginning. We'll do your serving for the whiskey and then your cheese pairing, because the specific whiskeys that we picked, we won't talk about until the very end. As we go through the entire process. But this is kind of my game plan for tonight. So this is an extreme amount of information, and I'm sure everybody's got, their favorite whiskey that they go to, and, either if it's for their special occasion whiskey or, if they have their little pour every single night, which I definitely am on par with that. But yeah, this is kind of what we're going to talk about. So if anybody's got any intro kind of questions, ask it now before we jump into it. No epiphanies yet?
You guys are welcome to ask questions at any point throughout the presentation and the tasting, and
Exactly.
go to town.
So kind of backwards, but we're going to talk more about serving and pairing real quick, so we can talk about the cheeses before we get into what makes whiskey. So I'll let Brittany kind of say what cheeses you guys have, and then I'll talk more on real quick any kind of serving and sensory. That way you guys can taste throughout this presentation, because I want you to be able to see each one of these whiskeys in a different dimension throughout before we actually get to talking of each one individually.
Hold on.
Did I say that too fast?
No, you're good. Hold on. Okay, can everyone see me in the corner?
Yep. Yes.
Okay, so you guys have a lovely cheese box on the top, has the different names, but I cut every single cheese into a different shape for you. So as we go through things, we'll mention what shape you need to eat. So in your box, you're gonna have, I put them all hopefully in the same order. In the back of your box, you're gonna have a triangle shaped cheese. It's gonna have the brown rind on the back. That is gonna, yep, like that. I see Judy's. That is a 6-month aged Manchego. It is going to be from Spain. It's a sheep's milk cheese. So we gave you cheeses from multiple countries. That cheese is actually made in the little tiny cup that's there. That cheese is made to be eaten with that jelly. That jelly is called a membrillo. Has anyone had membrillo before?
No.
No, it is made from a quince, which is kind of like an apple pear flavoring. And then they basically cook it down and then add a bunch of gelatin to make this membrillo. And the membrillo is specifically made to be paired with Manchego. And the Manchego is specifically been created to pair with the membrillo. So we recommend you eating them together. Be careful, it is quite addictive.
Put it with some
Your second cheese that's in the box, as you kind of make your way, I'll kind of go in a clockwise around your box. Your next one should be, it's cut into a triangle section, but it will not have any rind. Depending on what slice of cheese you have, it may have little holes, almost like a Swiss, but it's not. That is going to be your guys' Point Reyes Toma. So that is a semi-hard cheese. It should have a real creamy, grassy, buttery, tangy finish. We'll get to the pairings later on, but it'll give you some background on that. And then kind of next to where the portion cup is going to be a square shaped white cheese. My screen really blows the cheeses out because they're all white. That is going to be a aged cheddar. Now, this is different than your traditional aged cheddar. Instead of like a 6 or a 9 month age, this is 15 months. So it's going to be have a lot more tang, a lot more like nutty flavor to that. I'm sure you all can guess what we're going to pair that with. And then you guys should each have 2 slices. It'll give you about 4 or 5 bites, depending on how much you have, of a Saint-Nigel brie. It is from France. It is a triple cream. It is as rich as they come, but it has a much deeper flavor than a lot of bries, almost a little bit of an umami. So it'll be really fun for your pairing later. And then your last cheese is my favorite cheese that you guys will have tonight. And it is the one that's kind of shaped in the rectangle. It's going to be the kind of yellowest one of the group, has a very crystalline texture. And that is your Carlina 3-year aged Gouda. So unlike your guys' traditional Gouda, it's like what you buy like a lot of times at Trader Joe's or Save Mart, where it's like a double cream and it's kind of like real soft. This is going to be really hard, almost like a Parmigiano. Lots of nutty, honey, caramely flavors. So all of your cheeses, if you didn't notice, are aged at least 6 months up to 3 years. Whiskeys pair well with aged cheese, more so than a fresher cheese. They blend well together. So that's what's in your box. Make sure you save a little bit of each one so that you can taste them with the whiskeys. Judy, you have a question?
Yeah, did you get these at Whole Foods?
Yeah.
Okay.
I did. We can pair them similarly to, you can now order them through Amazon and have them shipped to your house. The only one that's specific to Whole Foods that you can't get anywhere else is going to be the Irish cheddar, the 15-month age. You can get because it's made by Kerrygold, but the Kalari aged cheddar, which is the 15-month, is exclusive to Whole Foods. But the traditional Kalari or the traditional Kerrygold cheddar, you can get most places, and it is really good. This one, just with that age, pairs better with the whiskey.
They have a reserve one, a reserve Irish cheddar, Kerrygold at Sprouts.
Yeah. So this one is like one step above that. So you have your regular, your reserve, and then the specialty one. We went all out for you guys tonight. Your Saint-Nigel brie is going to be square shaped. Trader Joe's does have one very similar. They have several really great bries that you can go if you don't want to drive to Whole Foods. They also have some. They have actually the exact same cheddar or Manchego that you guys are having tonight. So you can definitely get it there as well. So Mitchell, I will let you take back over and I'll pin you back onto the top.
Fantastic.
There you go.
All right. Cool set of cheese. All right. So real quick, before we actually get into whiskey, I'm assuming everybody has a glassware of some kind to taste with. So there's 3 ways I want you all to try and play with tasting tonight while we're going through this. The first would be neat. And by neat, I mean there's nothing else in the glass. You just want to put, not even, I would say a quarter of the little taster bottles that you guys have in. And by neat, this point, you're able to really kind of get the aromatics out. You're able to see what that expression is just as its own purest form. The next way, and you can be tasting, by the way, in all sorts of glasses. I have Glencairns for myself, regular rocks glasses if I want a big cube, or I have different rocks glasses with perforated bottoms to kind of almost decant while it's in my rocks glass if I just am drinking. But the second way I would try and taste it is with a few drops of water. And what that water is going to do is actually open up the whiskey. So the particles in the water are going to kind of connect to those elements of the whiskey and expand it all out. So it's almost, again, like decanting, but with water. Think of it as when you're going from barrel proof, which we'll talk about, down to like a cut of normal bottle proof. And then the third way I would try and taste is if you have a small little ice cube. Put a little cube of ice on that little bit of a sip that you tasted on and see what that small little chill factor is actually going to transition the whiskey ultimately to. So you get to see it in a pure form out of the bottle. You get to kind of see it
Regular
expand
glasses with a
into
nice scoop as well.
elegant the flavors. And then you're kind of seeing what its transition is, if it potentially could go into a cocktail, or if you just need something with a little bit more chill. So those are my only recommendations on how you might want to be doing your tasting tonight through it. Other than that, drink away and we'll have a good time. All right, so whiskey. Whiskey is kind of that fun spirit that unfortunately everybody gets confused about. So literally worldwide by the EU and America, whiskey's definition is a distillate of grains. That could be corn, that could be rye, that's malted barley, non-malted barley. You put in, but the second you say, oh, we're, sugar or potatoes or any of that kind of stuff, you are no longer whiskey. You are grains, and that makes you whiskey. You're either anything else, you're either rum or vodka, pisco or brandy or anything like that. When I used to work at Total Wine, it was always fun, having people in the aisles tell people that they're wrong or not with how to spell it. And in America, there's no legal way to spell it. Like, you can spell it with the E or without it. The way I have it on there, though, is how the different countries and whatnot has been over tradition of time. So America and Ireland, you use an E, everybody else, no E. Just kind of a fun fact. It was just always interesting to me how people got bent out of shape over that. So I just thought it was kind of interesting. All right, so whiskey production. For everybody that's been in my wine classes, we've always talked a little bit about how each one of the wines are made, which could be very different contrasting, if you're a natural winemaker, organic or whatnot. For the most part, whiskey production is whiskey production. These are the steps that we're going to go through, and we're going to talk about each one of them a little bit more. But this is the kind of the geeky nitty gritty of how you get to drink what you're drinking. Someone's DoorDash just got here. All right, so whiskey in these steps, it's an elaborate process. I mean, there's a reason why good whiskey is the prices that they are. It takes a lot to get there. So the first prep is what we call the mash prep, to basically create your recipe. Depending on where you are and what country and what you're trying to create is going to be limited by laws and regulations, of course, but you need to create a recipe. If you're in Scotland wanting to produce a single malt, you need to figure out exactly what clone of malted barley you're going to use, because that's all you are able to use is malted barley. Versus here in America, depending on what you're trying to label and produce, are you using 100% corn, you 100% rye? You need to figure out what your recipe is first and foremost. And that's ultimately what everybody refers to as your mash bill or your grain bill. Again, it's just their recipe. But this is the key point, because this is how you start the process of getting something that can be distilled. You can't just distill grains. You have to break it up. So the enzymes need to be broken down. Basically, you're trying to break down those grains and pull the sugars out. So ultimately, you're adding water into it. And this is why water is so key. When you look at Ireland and Scotland, where whiskey production is thought to originate in the world, you've got really specific springs that they were pulling out of, depending on what part of the islands they're on. Here in America, we got really lucky, in my opinion, because when everybody ran to the hills after the US tried to put its first initial tax on everybody, they went where they needed water anyway. So they found some really awesome springs with limestone and great minerals. And that has been able to develop such great whiskeys here in America. Any questions on this first step? Hopefully I'm not talking too fast.
I've muted a few of you guys just for background noise. If anyone has questions, I can always ask to unmute you or wave your hand at me, because I can see all your beautiful faces on my screen.
All right, so step 2, again, this is kind of the beginning stage. So to get an alcohol to distill, we have to actually create alcohol. So we're fermenting these grains. Alcohol wise, like I have on there, what we call beer. either distiller's beer or just new beer, anywhere from 5 to 10%. And again, depending on where you're making whiskey, Scotland is anywhere from 7 to 10 versus here in America, depending on, if you're in Tennessee versus Kentucky, Colorado, whatever. There's no law specifically, but the range of what your starting base is very dependent on its climate and its region. Just like anything, here in California, we make a lot of wine, but, Central California makes very fruity, high alcohol wine for the most part versus, if you're on the very like Santa Barbara or Sonoma coast, your wines are going to be a little bit lighter in alcohol and a little bit lighter in body. So same kind of concept on this, and also depending on the grains that they're using. This is a picture of just kind of the easy fermenters. So like in wines, we have cultured yeast. They're using what's called distiller's yeast in most cases. No one's doing ambient or wild yeast for the most part because it's not reliable enough. Everybody's in a business. They're here to make money as well as follow whatever heritage and tradition. They need to make sure it's going to create that alcohol and convert into those sugars the way they need to. So these are just the big fermenter tubs. Most places, specifically Scotland and Ireland, they start them in wood. Here in America, again, with production, the way it has created much more like factory sense, it's mostly stainless steel. And then ultimately, yeah, we're here in the fun part. This is where we're really starting to make it happen. No distillery that produces whiskey that I've ever heard is able to do a one and done. And by that, you're either distilling it twice to 3 times or continuously. Again, if you're starting at a 10% alcohol per liter, and you're putting that in as still, that first run through, you're probably only going to get that up to like 28% alcohol. And so then at that point, they're going to take the middle and the best cut of that 28% and redistill it again. These are pictures of pot stills at Teeling. This is an Irish distillery. Just got bought out by Beam Suntory, one of the larger ones, but also one of the more historic distilleries. So pot stilling is much cooler of a temperature. It's like what I call the low and slow. So Ireland is normally used for pot stilling. So they have to do those 2 to 3 batches. And that's why in a lot of cases, your Irish whiskey isn't going to be coming out super high on ABV because you're going from that 28% to maybe like 45 to that max 97. Questions on distilling before I ramble on some more about it? So we just kind of mentioned about pot distilling. So pot distilling, like I said, is low and slow versus there's another philosophy called column stills. And these basically are just huge columns. They're used in gin, they're used in vodka, they're used in lighter style whiskeys. And these are definitely much more high continuous production style. They're used all over the world. And this is your hot and fast. So I can get that alcohol up there really quick because it's going to hit 1-2 columns right after another and just crank up until it finally hits that distillate that I'm looking for. And then finally, this is kind of where the fun begins. Once you have a distillate, again, depending on where you are, what you're doing, and what your end goal is to create, you have an aging decision to make. Is it going into new oak? Is it going into aged oak? Is it going into a 60-gallon barrel? Is it going into a 700-liter barrel? All these are big decisions based on where you are and what the law can allow. Now, during this time, based on the laws that you have to play with, you also have to factor in your climate and how you're storing it. There's a lot of distilleries that are mass producing barrels, like 1,300 barrels a day, that they're standing barrels on top of each other in their warehouses. And there's not a lot of airflow when you do that. So the evaporation is much less versus like the picture in this rack house. This is Maker's Mark. These are, each barrel is on its own individual line. Granted, yeah, they're stacked, but it's not right on top of each other. So there's plenty of airflow in this. Ireland, Scotland, definitely a little bit more of a time needed to mature to get what the same result. And I actually have that stat on here. It's 3-1 basically is what a lot of experts in the industry are claiming um, for age potential of, as far as equality. And a lot of people, as far as consumers, I really hope we can talk about this tonight, is that there's a big difference between aged and mature. Just because your whiskey is 23 years, it might be over mature. It might be not mature enough. Again, depending on where it's coming from. In Kentucky, it's humid. The diurnal temperature changes from anything from freezing to 110, plus humidity. Versus Scotland, you've got a pretty moderate temperature overall, but your humidity level is even more constant. So a 25-year-old Scotch versus a 25-year-old, bourbon might be way too over oaked, ultimately, is what I'm getting at, or too under oaked. You guys are quiet tonight. Are we drinking too fast, or what's going on over here? No questions yet.
We had background noise, but I can't ask everyone to unmute if you guys want to chat.
No, it's all good. I mean, you guys are normally much more vocal.
I think when we get to the tasting part, I'll unmute everyone and then everyone can give their feedback.
Yeah. Okay. So after we've aged, we've hung on to this capital. We're sitting on these barrels as far as, however many we have and how many are different warehouses. I'm sure a lot of people have seen pictures of different distilleries here in the US with what they call campuses. They've got 8 or 9 different warehouses on different parts. You've got one in a valley, you've got one on a hill, one made out of brick, one made out of wood, one made out of metal. Well, after all that time has been spent holding this barrel, now you get to bottle it. And this is another one of those great kind of realms of what you're going to do with it. When the master distiller and the master blender are ultimately going through these barrels, they have to pick if they're going to leave it as a cask strength, if that's going to go into their normal house blend for what they're known for, or is it going to be a single barrel pick? You don't know until you taste these things. There's no 100% guarantee just because I've put that barrel A in barrel A spot from 10 years ago and replaced it for barrel B of the same recipe, that's going to taste the same. That time and age for those 10 years might have changed a lot from the 10 years prior. So it's truly an art at this point, especially when you're talking distilleries like everything we're tasting tonight. These are in productions in the millions. Every single one of the ones, Woodford is producing 1 million cases. Glenlivet, their 12-year for sure is over 1 million cases a year. They have to keep that consistency year in and year out to make sure that they're held to that standard by the consumers, basically. The single barrel and the barrel proof and the cask strength, those much more limited editions are where they get to have a little bit more room for flexibility. All right. No questions on production, on how it was made. I know that was a little bit geeky and dry, but I mean, anybody have any comments, questions, epiphanies about it? Cool, rock and roll. All right, Ireland. Ireland, by the majority of the professionals in the alcohol industry, is considered to be the original spot of whiskey, or as it translates back from, I forget how to pronounce it, but it basically is water of life, is how they originally called it. Ireland has a lot of rules and regulations, but at the same time, Ireland can get away with a lot more than certain things that Scotland can't, versus, say, America as well. And not say get away with, but they have a little bit more loopholes. So you might not be able to ship, whiskey out of Ireland in a wooden container, but you can definitely put it in a plastic container or a stainless steel container and then ship it out of Ireland and then bottle it later. So again, just lots of loopholes. These 6 bullet points, these are the core of how you actually have Irish whiskey. So it has to be distilled in Ireland. It has to be bottled in Ireland. If you take those away, you're done. You no longer can call it Irish whiskey. Does anybody drink Irish whiskey on a regular? This is Dalton's, Brittany. Has anybody got a favorite Irish whiskey? No
No, you
comment.
can't see it.
Irish mist with
Irish
his
mist.
liqueur.
Mm-hmm.
It's excellent.
Hey, Mitchell, this is Chris. I actually went to Ireland 2 years ago and
Yeah.
I had a few different ones, but I can only remember Jameson.
Okay.
Oh, tell them what yours are.
And
So,
mine's Powers.
Powers.
Which I
Yeah.
believe Jameson owns Powers now.
Well, Middleton owns Powers and Jameson.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've been to Middleton and to Dublin's Jameson distilleries, and they're great.
Yeah, it's a fantastic tour. I haven't had the opportunity to go, but I know a lot of the reps here in America that have shown me plenty of pictures showing off to me.
It's fun.
Looks like a
It's
good
very
time.
fun.
It's
Very
fun.
fun.
So I got a little map here on the side. This is the current image of where distilleries are in Ireland, as well as some of the proposed and newer ones that are coming up into the country. There are certain parts of Ireland that might have back in the 1700s, 1800s, might have had 20, 30 distilleries within that range of that region, but now there might only be two. Between World War I, World War II, different kind of either prohibitions or depression, distilleries have come in and come out. So the cool thing is when you've got bigger companies like Middleton or Teeling, they've come and they've bought in some of these older defunct distilleries out and have given them new life and given them a second chapter to give back to the world and what they can. Fun fact, Irish Pointing, this is something that is super cool and super geeky. If you can ever find in any of the stores, I don't know of anywhere in Fresno that might, maybe the Market over off Hernan West. This is not whiskey according to America because there is sugar cane as the distillate in it as well, but it is a blend of malted barley and sugar cane. It is definitely much more like a liqueur, but it is absolutely sensational if you can find some. And it's one of the newer kind of protected labels.
What's the name?
Irish Pointing.
Oh, I see that.
That's
Irish
like
Pointing,
Newfound.
that's just that's the category that's in. I can't think of any of the actual labels or producers,
Okay.
but just kind of start Googling it around. There's some cool stuff out there. So besides obviously being on one island from another, one of the biggest taste-wise differences and use-wise, and I have this on here, is peat in Scotland is much more heavily used than in Ireland. Not to say it's not used. There is still
The peaty taste.
peat, and peat is used in a good amount of distilleries. It is just not as abundant as it is in Scotland. And you can call that their own tick for tack or whatnot in different regions. But to that, then your texture ultimately is going to be what is then the defining moment. If I were to blind taste people on Scotch versus Irish whiskey and just say the most basic of basic ones, I'm willing to bet every single person would get it just based on the texture of that much more oily texture for Irish whiskey versus with that peat texture from the kindling, you're going to get just a little bit more of a robust dryness on the Scotch. So with that, we are talking about Wolfhound. Has anybody tasted this before? No. Has anybody tasted it since I started talking?
No.
Now?
No.
Cool.
Now?
Please start drinking. Please start drinking. You guys normally ask a lot more questions once one or two tastings have happened.
I've asked everyone to unmute so you guys can all share. This is now the part where we like participation.
Absolutely. So Wolfhound was always thought when I was hired on by Total Wine as a private label. It is not. This is a label that is owned by Teeling, aka Beam Suntory. They bought this in 2018.
It's
They bought
exactly,
Teeling.
I remember it. I just wet my lips.
But this is an extremely old distillery. It was potato. They were just doing raw, basically synthetics, or not synthetic, but natural spirits, no age statements,
What
nothing
cheese is
initially.
supposed to eat with that?
And this is why I was kind of saying you just kind of get new life into it. This is considered a blended Irish whiskey. So Ireland has several different categories, just like
Water doesn't-
Scotland. You can have Irish grain whiskey, you can have Irish malt whiskey, and then the biggest category, which everybody drinks, like Jameson, this
Yeah,
most
you definitely get
is
good
blended
memories.
whiskey.
There's some in here.
Before you guys give your feedback, the cheese, just a reminder, the cheese that we had selected to pair with this is going to be that 15-month aged cheddar. So the square that's in your tasting box. The other thing that would also pair well with it and is recommended for a pairing would be a soft cheese like a brie. So if you have extra of your Saint-Nigel brie, you can also try it with the brie versus the cheddar and see if that changes the flavor or the experience for you. So you could taste with either, though we recommended tasting with the cheddar. We kept it in the Irish family.
I'm excited to see what you guys think. Just a few more things about Ireland. So like I said, Ireland has its regulations, but most Irish whiskey is pot distilled, especially once you get into your single malt Irish whiskey or your single grain Irish whiskey. But when you've got blended whiskeys like this, it could be both pot and column. Again, they're producing a lot of this, so they need to make sure that it's a consistent level. So the pot gives it its basic cognagers or esters, as we say, and those are the flavor profiles. And then they're distilling a lot in the column as well as basically that fill.
You want it back? I just want to try.
So what does, where it says it's converted from a potato distillery, what is the, what was it converted to?
So the distillery before, I forget its name, before it became the Cooley distillery, yeah, it distilled potatoes. So basically like vodka. Now it is converted to a whiskey distillery. So they are set up for pot stills as well as column stills. And so there's the only thing that runs through this is either grain or malted barley. And by grain, that is anything besides malted barley. So it could be unmalted barley, it could be corn, it could be rye.
You drink it, then it's not bad.
Those are the only things that are going
The
through this
water.
distillery now.
That does make a huge difference. Yeah.
Mitchell, when you're tasting whiskey, when you're tasting wine, you swirl it to aerate it and stuff.
Totally.
Do you do anything like that for tasting whiskey?
Absolutely. So, you know, with wine, we normally stick our nose in halfway, you know,
Yeah,
that way we
yeah,
really
yeah.
get that schnoz in there.
Uh-huh.
When you're nosing whiskey, especially if you're in Glencairn or even just a rocks glass, you know, it is definitely much more of a rounded kind of bypass of the nose. I mean, it's not
okay.
like swinging it around. It's definitely, I rock it kind of side by side, to be honest with you, because again, depending on the alcohol that's coming out of that whiskey, if you just stick your nose in there, you're going to burn all your sensories out. Like you're going to be one and done. And then at that point, you're not going to taste anything and you're going to be unhappy. So that's kind of the thing. Ultimately, once you really get into tasting whiskey on a regular basis, your nose almost trains itself not to get burnt out on it first. I mean, I could now stick my nose in a Glencairn on 127 proof whiskeys and just pick up the aromatics. Whereas probably 4 years ago, I would have been pouty and really upset at the bar that I did that to myself. But yeah, swirling it around definitely helps. I mean, it's not the same as wine in that sense, but when you do those couple drops of water, that's when swirling really is going to make the big difference. Because again, you're kind of combining and mixing those layers of that water to alcohol.
Okay, so that's when you get the ice cube.
And then, yeah, the ice cube, it just depends on how cold you really want it, is how fast you want to swirl it.
I like
But
it. This is neat.
What did everyone think of that one? Thoughts, questions?
I like it better than Bruce's Powers.
So Powers, if I remember correctly, they make a single malt as well as a single grain type Irish whiskey. So with that, you've got single malt, which is your malted barley, just like Scotland, versus your grain, you are any of the other grains. And so when I say single, though, a lot of people get confused is that means it's only a one product type. That is not the case. Single means it is deriving from a single distillery. Only one place was it distilled at. You can have 4 or 5 other grains in there, but if it's coming from one distillery, then you can put single grain. Versus single malt, it's only malted barley from one distillery.
Okay, that's good to know. I wasn't quite sure about that.
Scotland and Ireland both, I forgot to mention this, both also have a minimum age statement. You are required to age barrels for a minimum of 3 years in both Ireland and Scotland in any capacity. If it's blended Irish whiskey, if it's a single Irish whiskey, it's got to be 3 years in barrel at some. All right, so we're rolling on over to the neighboring islands of Scotland over here. So again, Scotland, pretty similar in some aspects, but at the same time,
I don't think
they have a
this-
different set. So in this, I don't know if you'll notice, but Scotland has the requirement that it needs to be aged in oak cask in Scotland at a licensed exercise warehouse. Ireland doesn't have that requirement. It just has to be aged in Ireland. So if something falls off a truck, but everybody knows it fell off the truck and is just in a warehouse so they don't have to claim taxes, that potentially could have happened at one point. And they just never fixed that loophole. So there's a lot of little mini warehouses around Ireland that aren't the same in Scotland because they definitely have regulatory boards and everything. Not saying Ireland doesn't again, but again, these
For
are
taxes, right?
these are old tax loopholes, yeah, that technically haven't been changed. Again, Scotland's water is a little bit more soft. Same with Ireland. They're softer waters than say over here in America. So that is more helping a little bit more of that longevity because you don't have as many minerals fighting against the distillate. Does anybody have any Scotch questions or stories that they've had talking to other people about Scotch or things that they're really trying to understand about Scotch specifically? Because this is a pretty, there's so much information. I didn't know what to put on here until I had some of your guys' questions. No?
It's a
Okay.
quiet group tonight.
Yeah, drink more.
What makes Scotch taste smoky? Sometimes I think it tastes
Peat.
smoky.
That's the
Is
piece.
it
So
peat?
Scotland, yeah, so that is peat. So peat is a naturally occurring vegetal product that is used in what, so in the process of production, I kind of skimmed over it a little bit, but there's a thing called kindling. And this is where you're almost roasting the grains. And at this point, you're roasting it after to caramelize the sugars after they've gotten their initial wash, where the enzymes are broken up. And now you've got to dry them back out before you wash them again. So in Scotland, what they do is they've got these big peat boxes on top of their wood boxes, and they're burning this peat in there while they're roasting to caramelize these grains again. Everybody else doesn't do that because they necessarily don't have that vegetal growth. I mean, Scotland is on an island. As you guys can see by this map, I mean, there's more little nooks and crannies, you know, that grow moss than most other countries. So at that point, it's then a matter of how much peat and how much exposure you give to those grains while they're doing it. Most of us call it peat reek in the business, you know, especially if you put your nose in like, you know, an arbor Scotch or a Lagavulin or something like that. You know, you're just like, whoa, I just smell vegetable smoke. That's peat reek. And the more peat reek you have, I mean, it's non-defined scale, but that's your biggest influence for Scotch is your peat influence. So Scotch, though, does play around with some cool things as far as its age statement and bottling. I'm sure everybody's been into Total or Costco at one point and seen a vintage Scotch, you know, bottled at or 1978 or whatever, right? So Scotland really plays with the fact that, yeah, you can have these vintage bottlings because ultimately Scotland does age things out a little longer, but you have to have 2 dates on there. So you have to have the distillate date, the bottled date, and then ultimately how many years in between. So, you know, if you're 2010, well, now we're in 2020, you've got a 20-year-old Scotch. But those are far and few between, most regulars. So like Macallan 12 or the Glenlivet that we're going to taste 12, there could be some older stuff in there, but they're labeling off the youngest part. And that one part could only be 1% ultimately. That could be one barrel out of 100,000. But because that one barrel is in there, that's only a 12-year Scotch. Even if everything is like 15, 20 years, it's only a 12-year Scotch.
Does Scotland make a bigger deal about the aging than other whiskeys? It seems like they do.
Yes, so single malt specifically really brought that in, and Scotland was brilliant. We'll talk about that a little bit with Glenlivet specifically, especially here in America marketing. When we got out of our prohibition and then the Depression, Scotch was the producer that was there ready, knocking on the door, as well as Canadian whiskey. But the hierarchy of Scotch in Scotland that had been producing already, they're coming into America after prohibition, hey, I've got this 12-year-old bottle. Hey, I've got this 21-year-old bottle. This is what class and this is what, high society drinks in Europe. It was a huge marketing thing, and it's been over since. So that's why in a lot of cases now you'll still talk to, whiskey connoisseurs, and you'll talk majority of American whiskey is substantially less than single malt Scotch. Single malt Scotch, though, only really makes up 10% of the world market as far as Scotch go. 90% of all Scotch is blended Scotch that's sold worldwide. And doesn't mean that's bad. It's just blended Scotch is typically where it is, because again, a warehouse to be a single malt Scotch in Scotland, you can only be from one distillery, and it can only be malted barley. You can have single grain Scotch. It can only be one distillery, but it can be any of the other grains. Versus
So
blended.
20-year, I'm sorry.
And I was just going to say, versus blended is a composition of any of all, or it could be from two different distilleries, two different blends of unmalted or versus malted barley. The oyster is basically whoever wants to crack it at that point.
So a 12-year versus a 20-year, what's the big difference?
In theory, 8 years.
Well, thank you.
But
Night,
again,
everybody.
so again, the law is that they have to label it off the minimum. So
Yeah.
for me as a business, though, that makes zero sense for me to only put one barrel, say out of 100 barrels, and then have to label it as that lower age. Because after all this capital and time I've spent after producing this whiskey that's been sitting in a barrel for 12 years, I'm not going to put it in with a lot that's with 20-year-old barrels. So I'm going to make sure that my lots are pretty consistent. If it's a 20-year Scotch, I'd be willing to bet 95% of that's 20. There might be a barrel or two that might be 21 or 22, just to give it a little bit of extra dimension to it. And even then, that percentage might be pretty low now in the game, because again, these guys are trying to make money. It's a business. They're not going to put, because a 12-year versus a 20-year price point, you're talking anywhere from a couple $100 to a couple $1,000, depending on the producer.
So what I was asking was, so a 20-year has more dimension than a 12-year. Is that the difference? Or
again, in theory, it depends on where the distillery is. So on this map, you can kind of see. So we're talking 5 different regions. So we've got the Highlands, we've got the Lowlands, we've got Campbelltown, we've got Islay, and Speyside. So each one of these regions is known for a different style of Scotch. So you've got Islay, which is a little bit more peated. You've got Lowlands, which is a little bit more of a softer, lighter. Highlands is kind of that mid-king. It kind of floats on everybody's palate. Campbelltown, Islay are, the islands are definitely a lot more peated as well. So if you are in a distillery in, say, the middle of the Highlands, so the middle of the country, and you're aging your whiskey, there's not a lot of influence, right, from like the ocean and everything else. So a 12-year whiskey there might be kind of the same as maybe a 12-year whiskey out of Campbelltown, because Campbelltown has so much more of a different range of humidity. It's got, a lot more current from the salt coming in and the air. It just all depends. And that's why initially when I was saying don't our biggest problem is always confusing just age versus maturity. Because again, that 20-year there doesn't always mean 20-year somewhere else is good or bad. Did that answer that, Judy? Or did I confuse that question again?
The bottom line is it worth the difference in price?
Depends on the producer and depends on your palate and depends on what you're wanting to spend. This is the great thing about any kind of alcohol, though, is, I mean, this is 100% up to your palate and what you feel is fair. Am I willing to spend, you know, $2,000, $1,800 for Macallan 25-year? Probably not. But am I
Not my,
but am I willing to try a 25-year from maybe an independent bottler that has pulled barrels from different regions and made a 25-year-old statement for $200, $300? Probably, absolutely. There's a lot of pedigree with the name. There's a lot of understanding of what's happening with these regions, though, too. That's as politically correct as I can make that answer.
Okay, thank you.
Now, my question is that once they empty those barrels of scotch or whatever alcohol they're making, do they use those barrels again, or they have new wood?
Yeah, so Scotland, great question. Scotland and Ireland are actually able to reuse and use used oak. America, and depending on what they're producing, is required to use brand new oak. In Scotland, you can use twice used, you can use 3-time used. There's no requirement on how old a barrel can be used or how, you know, what type of barrel age to put scotch in. So some of these, I'm sure everybody's seen now, there's a lot, it's been a big fad over the last couple of years since it was legally allowed, are finished barrels. So I've got one, this is my beautiful, speaking of independent bottlers. So this is a bottling that Alexander Murray did for Costco. This is a 20-year-old scotch, but it's finished in sherry and bourbon barrels. So because these other countries can't reuse these barrels, but once Scotland has, or once Scotch has been in those 3 barrel or that 3-year time in that initial barrel, they can put it in another barrel. No problem, no questions asked. But those initial 3 years could have been used oak to begin with, though, too. So the flavor is really going to come in what they call finished oak.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one of the bigger differentiations. We in America, we want our brand new oak versus over there. You can use American oak, European oak from anywhere. It could be brand new, it could be used. All right, so
do you have all this?
kind of a cool story, in my opinion. Again, this was really the distillery that was knocking on America's door after Prohibition that said, "Hi, I'm here waiting for you, drink my scotch." But before that, this is a company that really came to be from not following the law. So this was George Smith, as I have on here. He was a smuggler. He smuggled whiskey all up and down this country when it was illegal, and started doing blends himself and started putting it together and started distilling. And at one point, for whatever reason, the King of Scotland found his distillery with his men, and he thought he was going to prison. But instead, the king at that time actually made his whiskey the royal whiskey of the time, because he had heard and the reputation and all this and that. So he became instantly famous by getting on the good side of the king. And then at that moment became legally making scotch. Funny what happens when a royal comes in and says, "Hey, I like your stuff."
Of course.
Yeah, I mean, it's always fun. So this is kind of a key classic. This is one of the more classic examples of a 12-year scotch. So this is a Speyside scotch. So this is another little fun snippet. Speyside is actually a sub-region of the Highlands, which was that big key region right in the middle of Scotland. It wasn't until a few years back that actually they were able to get their own PGI, that's a protected geographic indicator, to be under their own region. Which is really cool, and it definitely has its own uniqueness, but it is technically Highland as well. So they're using European and American oak, European to start with, and then they finish it in American oak.
It's smoother though.
How do we feel about this one?
It's smooth. It's not as smoky as some scotch.
True.
Yeah,
So again, Highland in Speyside aren't going to be nearly as smoky as like Isla or Campbelltown or anything like that. Speyside a little bit more than just the base key section of Highland, but not a lot. Again, this is, I don't want to use the word entry level, but this is a gateway Scotch.
Gosh. I did notice that that one is much smoother than the first one we tried, but just as strong.
Yeah, alcohol wise, these all should be pretty close to each other. They all should be about that 40%, which is the minimum requirement once it's bottled. But going into the barrel, these were coming in probably 125 proof, which divide by 2, you're looking at like 65% alcohol.
Wow.
And then they water it down before bottling.
How
Definitely
much
smooth,
do they water
especially right
down?
after the Wolfhound, and almost a little sweet.
Say that again. Sorry. Okay.
Almost a little sweet. It definitely smoother right after the Wolfhound, and then almost like a little sweetness too.
Okay. So I would agree. So to me, the Wolfhound, it's only distilled 3 times in a pot still. So again, remember, pot stills are low and slow. So you've got a little bit more of those cognigers and esters of the flavors, but there's no peat. So they're trying to hit that balance of that oily texture with those flavors hitting in versus the Scotch. They are typically in pot still, but this could definitely hit a lot more column still. And with that peat, so they're trying to really hit it on that balance side. Plus this has a little bit more oak influence, significantly more oak influence than the Wolfhound.
What cheese?
Someone else was asking a question.
This one we have you guys pairing with the brie. You could also pair Scotches pair really well with like camemberts or blue cheese, but we did not want to put that in your guys' box because when you do that, it tends to make every cheese kind of taste like that. And it's a very polarizing choice. You either really like it or you really don't. So we paired it with the brie. It should complement that smoothness there and be nice and rich, kind of balance it out well.
That's a very nice brie.
That brie is so good.
It's a nice one.
Beautiful.
It's a fantastic brie. Yes.
So creamy.
Yeah, that brie is one of those things that the French are known for it, and it's a cow's milk, and it's a triple cream. So unlike a lot of bries that are double, they'll add in that it's lots and lots of cream, but it's really good. That one also pairs really well if you have like cherries, fresh cherries to go with it, is what they recommend complementing, which would also go well with your guys' Scotch selection.
So we kind of, both Irish and Irish whiskey and Scotch, I'm just kind of hitting the very big broad strokes right now for you guys. If we ever wanted to do an individual unit on Scotch or Irish whiskey, that would be when we would compare, region to region, so you guys can really see the different types and what each one of these different distilleries of different regions are really hitting on. Because it gets wild when you're really tasting side by side and you're like, oh, okay, so this is what this is known for.
Thank you.
Do they have any distilleries in the United States that make these different liquor from different countries?
So in America, it is free game. We make all sorts of stuff as far as whiskey goes. And we'll talk about that a little bit, but yeah, absolutely. We make single malt whiskey here in America. We make single grain whiskey, and we make blended whiskey, bourbon, you name it, we make it here. It definitely, say like peated single malt here out of America is a different style for sure, though, still than comparative to Scotch. And again, that is much more of a climatic thing. If I'm trying to make single malt with peat here out of Kentucky and it's, 90% humidity, that's not happening over in Scotland, so that fluctuation of what's happening in the barrel is so much more dramatic than what's over there. Because while the liquor, or the whiskeys in these barrels, it's absorbing, it's contracting, it's expanding, it's doing all sorts of stuff while it's sitting in these rack houses. And so the wood influence, again, being new or used over there versus brand new. There's so many different influences.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Anybody else have any questions on Scotch before we come to America here?
See,
As far as the peat or the peat reek, any like more or less at different price points, or it just varies?
It definitely varies. If you're looking for less, you're always, for the most part, going to find much less peat in blended scotches. And the reason why is, again, not saying that any is specifically cheaper than less. I mean, look at some of the, the labels of like Johnny Walker and stuff. That's a blended scotch. But when you're combining malted barley versus grains, you're kind of changing up the game a little bit, because that peat is what's clinging on specifically to barley. Those enzymes are connecting basically. So when you've got a combination of other flavors going in, your peat factor is probably going to go down pretty seriousness.
Right on.
okay.
But again, personal taste, personal how much you want to spend. I mean, the gambit's real. All right, America whiskey. Man, there's a lot. Like I said, we produce pretty much anything and everything that we absolutely can here. Gotta love capitalism. We're all trying to make a buck. But whiskey really started from that day one when we came over from the UK, Spain, and everything else. When settlers landed in Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania grows rye like crazy. Virginia grows corn like crazy. These are not only good food sources, but they are kind of the two key grains that can be distilled. Not necessarily easy to distill, but they are kind of the main go-to points for distilling. And so it really took off ultimately, but at the same time, it also is what shut us down for being known as whiskeys, is when in 1791, when our new fledged American government decided, hey, we're going to tax you guys on this. Everybody hated it because we just got out of being taxed. So at this point, this is when, it was one of the first things in American history as far as being able to prove that, you can enforce laws. The militias were called in and they said, hey, you're paying tax or you're getting your barrel split open. At this point, that's when everybody kind of ran to the hills, and that is now the era and how moonshining and illegal whiskey running became such a thing almost for 100 years. And we still have moonshining and whiskey running today, because in America, we have our federal laws, but we also have our state laws. And these, in a lot of cases, are laws that are still in existence from the 1800s. We have not updated a lot of our American laws as far as alcohol goes. Even stuff pre-prohibition. It's pretty wild and pretty incredibly crazy. But this is an era that we're almost still stuck in. Okay, I'm assuming most everybody's either had bourbon or American whiskey or something like that. Yeah, maybe once, twice.
300
Few more.
times. Yeah.
Okay.
3,000 times.
So is there, are we good at sipping still at this point? We're
This is the rye.
perfect. So I'm sure everybody's seen labels like Old Forester, E.H. Taylor. These guys not only are just labels anymore, but these guys truly were the grandfathers in American whiskey. And you can geek out and talk about these guys all day long. Old Forester actually was started by a guy named George Brown. He was a pharmacist. And at that time, whiskey was also in pharmacies, but he was a traveling pharmacist. And he was trying to convince people to buy his stuff. At that point, he wanted to try and differentiate himself. So he put it in a glass bottle and he put a label on it. That was kind of how this all started. So Old Forester got its name from George Brown, which is funny that Old Forester is now owned by Brown Forman, the company. But, that's where quality and the standards really hit in. And that wasn't until 1870. So that one tax from 1791 really screwed us as far as the country goes from understanding and trying to differentiate into better quality whiskey. Which, you know, in that meantime, you had people going blind. You had crazy moonshine that was not good. It was not tasty. It was basically just to get the job done as quick as possible, and no one cared. Next thing that really happened after that was the Bottle and Bond Act. I'm sure people have seen labels with it. This was not only huge for whiskey, but this was actually the first act to pass in America for food or any kind of consumable goods. This was the first regulatory act in America to pass for quality control, period.
So whiskey, wow. That's
And so
interesting.
for us being, you know, the sin thing, you know, with temperance and everything else, we were the first that were actually, and this was E.H. Taylor. He wanted to make sure that he was able to have a regulatory moment. He wanted the government to be involved. He wanted them to say, yes, you are producing something that can be sold to anybody of legal age. It is something that we can put our foot behind, and, you know, it's going to be hitting its quality that it needs to. And yeah, that happened in 1897, and that is something that's still true to this day, in keeping quality control up.
Brent, I saw you had your hand up a second ago for a question. Did you have a question for Mitchell?
Funny, because the screen just popped up, American whiskeys. What is the difference between bourbon and whiskey?
I'm going to get to that. Yeah, I'll be talking about that. But I was just finishing up here on Bottle and Bond. So Bottle and Bond does not only partake to just whiskey. You can make brandy and it can be bottled in bond. You can make vodka and it can be bottled in bond. Although I don't know why you would do that with vodka. So to be bottled in bond, here are your stipulations. It has to be bottled at 50% alcohol, AKA 100 proof.
Wow.
So it has to go into bottle. Whiskey in America goes into barrel at 125 proof. So it needs to get cut down a little bit with water. The whiskey is required to age for a minimum of 4 years in a regulated warehouse. So that means by regulated, a government employee from the TTB comes and sits and looks at your warehouse and makes sure that no one's been in there, make sure nothing's happened. It's under lock and key, 4 years. No one touches it. It is not stuck to just bourbon. It is not classified to just Kentucky. This is nationwide. You can have a bottle and a bond to hit those quality standards.
What is the TCB?
The TTB is the Trade and Tobacco Bureau. So they or Tax and Trade Bureau. They basically regulate and manage all labels, laws, anything alcohol related. So if we all wanted to go in on creating a whiskey, we have to submit our label to them. We have to submit where we're making it from. We have to submit what's on the label, and they have to approve all this. They're extremely slow. And
You can make privately 50 gallons a year yourself, as long as you don't sell it to anybody.
yes, there are. Yeah, it's kind of like you can make 20 gallons of beer a year for yourself without having to make yourself an incorporated brewery, which they still have to deal with the TTB if they want to go business. All
Well,
right.
we could do that at the clubhouse. We're not using it.
All right, guys. So bourbon. This is definitely another one of those fun comment questions I've always had with people in the whiskey aisles. Bourbon is American whiskey. All bourbon is American whiskey, but not all American whiskey is bourbon. To be bourbon, you have to be minimum 51% corn. You can be made anywhere in the US. It doesn't have to be just Kentucky. I can make bourbon here in California. Can't be bottled at anything less than 40%. Can't go distilled wise. Distilled versus barreled are two different things. So I could distill it up to 160 proof. So coming off the still, it could be coming in hotter than what I'm ultimately putting it in at the barrel at. So there's going to be some water cutting in between that even. And the reason why is 125 is all American whiskeys, but When you cut it a little bit, there's evaporation ultimately. So you're still going to be able to come out of that barrel, say, I mean, I've got Booker here that's at 127. So it actually, enough water evaporated out of that the concentration of the ethanol actually got hotter.
For the angels.
Yeah. The other thing that is always a big misconception is it has to be in new oak. It does not have to be American oak. It has to be brand new oak, but is not required to be American. Lots of fun with people with that one. It does not have to be American oak. 99.99999% of the time it is, but it does not require to be. Any questions on bourbon, on what defines bourbon? So once you have a bourbon, and you can then have all sorts of American whiskeys, there's all sorts of little fun little tidbits on top of that. You then can have what's called straight bourbon. Straight bourbon has to be in barrel for a minimum of 2 years. So once you have a barrel that's been aged for 2 years, and that could be rye, that could be any kind of blended grains of American whiskey, you can call it, well, actually you can't. You have straight corn, you have straight wheat, you have rye, whatever. But once you hit 4 years, this is where it's also fun. At 4 years, you are then allowed to do an age statement on your bottle. So if I have here.
Is that when you have an age statement?
So I've got an E.H. Taylor small batch. This does not have an age statement, but it is straight. So this has been in barrel for 2 years before it was released versus my Heaven Hill bottle, which is 7 years old. So it's past that 4-year mark that can have an age statement, but not required.
Tell us about the one we're drinking.
You guys are drinking Woodford, which I'm going to talk about. I just have a bunch of bottles for examples on all sorts of stuff. Yeah, between that 2 and 4 year, it's kind of like, what do I do with it? Because you have to age statement in between that 2 and 4 years. But are you going to age state it at 3 years? You're going to be like, oh, I've got a 3-year-old whiskey. Excuse me, you don't have to age state it. And that's why, because you're not going to age state a 3-year-old whiskey, right? Versus being straight, you know that quality is there for at least 24 months. All right. So on to the bourbon that we are tasting tonight. So this is Woodford Reserve.
Taste it.
This is kind of a classic staple, even though this is honestly a fairly young product as far as bourbon and whiskey are concerned. It's had a pretty good history as far as the distillery goes, but Woodford actually didn't come around until 96. At 96, this was kind of as .com. There was a lot of money coming in. People were starting to drink bourbon, but unfortunately then late 90s, early 2000, bourbon then fell out. I can't tell you how many old sales reps I've talked to. I'm sure everybody's heard of Pappy Van Winkle. If you haven't, we'll talk about it. But Pappy Van Winkle is the most sought after American whiskey to date at this point. But in the late 90s, early 2000s, I have reps that have told they couldn't give it away, which is absolutely insane to me. That there was a time, that you could actually buy it off any shelf on any liquor store. So Woodford Reserve, this is owned by Brown-Forman. Brown-Forman is probably top 5 as far as domestic companies in alcohol. They own all sorts of things. They own Old Forester. They own Sonoma-Cutrer wine for all of us winos that do that as well. The cool thing to me about this, though, is this was a project that Chris Morris, who actually came over from Scotland, and at the time his assistant Elizabeth McCall, at this time when she got assigned to Woodford, she was the youngest assistant distiller to take over and lead a project, man or woman. And she's a badass. She has one of the most amazing palates I've ever listened to. or had the opportunity to like listen to her talk about flavors and dimensions that she's picked up on things. Yeah, she's gonna take it places I've never heard, that I don't think the whiskey world is ready to truly see yet at this point. I have the mash bill on there, so that's the recipe that we talked about at the very beginning of the night. So again, this is bourbon, so it has to be a minimum of 51% corn. Can go more. Most of the time, most bourbons are actually up there in between that 70 and 75%. And then it's got its rye and malted or wheat as the backside. What do we think about this guy?
I like it.
So that one we paired for you guys with the Manchego, with the Membrillo, the quince paste. Bourbon goes really well with apple. Quince is in that same flavor profile. So that's why we paired them together to balance it out. Bourbon also really goes well if you want to try something different, goes really well with cloth bound aged cheddars. So if you still have any of the Irish white cheddar, slightly different, but will still give you a different taste. So you can try it with both and see what you like. But you basically with this one want something with some coffee, nutty flavoring content to the cheese, which the Manchego does when you mix it with the quince does really well.
Absolutely. So kind of finishing off on Woodford here. Again, it's a newer brand ultimately. But again, this was that key opportunity as .com was coming in. There was a lot of money, but Brown-Forman didn't want people buying Scotch. So this was that fill in the gap in between. Again, bourbon was cheap. People were buying bourbon for pennies on the dollar of what values are now. Now you pick up this bottle for like 25 to 30 bucks, which is, I think, a good value. All right. Listening from you guys, does anybody have any favorite bourbons that they really like? And I'm going to just completely take off the table Blanton's, any of the Pappy Van Winkles. Those are all off the table. Does anybody have any other bourbons that they extremely enjoy and like? No, we're all a bunch of snobs and we all just like BTAC and Blanton's.
Buffalo Trace for the everyday drink.
There you go. Okay. Yeah.
Victor's.
Michter's. Yeah. What Michter's? Just out of curiosity.
We're going to get it. Hold on.
So I'm glad someone brought up Michter's, just because I have a bottle that I want to show talking about American whiskey that they're keenly known for. I heard someone else say Four Roses. Absolutely.
Yes.
Four Roses. Talking about some here, they have absolutely dominated the market on cultivating, creating specific yeast strains. So we talked earlier about yeast with the fermentation process on getting those grains fermented into an alcohol, so it's distilled. Four Roses has probably 20 different yeast strains at this point that have been able to curate different flavors, even though it's the same recipe, for their single barrel projects. And I mean, hats off to them. That's a crazy cool niche in the category. If you ever get an opportunity, try out some of their single barrels. They always put their yeast strain on the side. So it's always a fun to be able to taste them side by side. They run anywhere from 45 to 60 bucks a bottle.
How did we like that one compared to the others so far? What's everyone's thoughts? Someone share. I'm gonna be like a teacher and randomly call your name and unmute you.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm gonna share some labels here, and we're gonna talk about some of the things that each one of these labels kind of have. Again, these are things to look for. These are always good conversation starters. So someone said Michter's earlier. Michter's is known specifically for their sour mash bottling as well, besides their 10-year and their 20-year that no one can get access to, because it's secondary market and no one wants to pay ridiculous amounts. Anyway, sour mash, what that means is they actually take a bit of that initial, so from their fermentation to distilling, they take that kind of bottom residue and they put it back into the next batch. And basically what that does is it kickstarts. So you've got consistency at that point. Really kind of a cool concept. A lot of people thought it was a negative thing because, you know, why am I going to take my dredges and just put it back? Well, they're starting off with a good product anyway, so it's not like bad, you know, it's just the bottom of that distillate. So they're putting it back to reactivate those flavors and those enzymes.
You can have it. I don't like
Popular
it.
with it. So that's one of the other ones. There's all sorts of labels. You've got the fun stuff like Jack Daniel's. They've got this bottling. This is multiple things. So it is a single barrel. So this is one of the times that you actually can have, it's a single barrel. So this is one barrel, that's it. It is also barrel proof. So that means there's no cutting. So they picked that barrel and they dumped it and put it straight in a bottle. There was no adding water to it. There was nothing. Now, most whiskeys, again, the Woodford that you just had, that is technically a blend. That didn't come from just one barrel. That came from probably 200,000 barrels of that lot that all got dumped and then put into a tank and then bottled. So that's that's another point that I really want to drive home. You know, these things, it's production. You know, so we're talking when we say 12-year-old Knob Creek bourbon.
Oh, no, man.
You know, this came from a much smaller batch than, say, the Woodford that we're sipping on. But this also probably came from a batch of, 300-400 barrels. However many barrels they dump a day of that day that they were like, all right, that's our 12-year.
Hey, Mitchell,
Yeah.
what price point was the, what was it, the Jack Daniels that you just showed us, the single barrel? Is that like 40, $50?
Well, yeah, I'll say that normally is what this, again, I luckily work in the industry, so I get a little different pricing, but yeah, this is about $45-50.
Okay.
And it all depends. So again, I'm sure everybody's seen, the world is crazy right now with barrel picks. Stores do it, groups are doing it. This is the opportunity for them to, as buyers, go and make that specific barrel pick themselves and then sell it as, hey, we curated this barrel pick. There are a lot of barrels. Again, Blanton's is a single barrel. That it doesn't get picked by anybody. That's just always a single barrel. You could always see the handwritten inscription on the side of the label. Not necessarily better than, say, a 12-year or not. Especially at the rate they're dumping stuff. I got a bottle of Blanton's a couple weeks ago that had been dumped out in November and was bottled in November or something like that of 2018. It was the bare minimum of a 2-year bottling. Most Blantons, though, were about 6 to 7 years, but they don't put age statements on there anymore. They haven't for a while, but that's why you look at these different labels, because each one of these labels tell a story ultimately. Again, single barrel versus cask strength or barrel strength, an age statement, bottle and bond, straight, non-straight, whatever. It's basically like deciphering codes. Any other questions before we kind of move on to our last one, before I open it up for truly any questions? Okay, so Brittany and I had a little bit of struggles with stock issues with whiskey. So I made this slide thinking this was what it was supposed to be. So I'm just going to upsell you guys, hopefully. Please drink your Jack Rye. Jack Daniel's is definitely a larger name, obviously. It's one of the top whiskey brands worldwide. Their rye was just released a few years ago, so it's a newer item on their agenda. Their rye, again, just like bourbon, to be a rye has to be 51% rye. The rest of that could be wheat, whatever. But 51% of that is rye. And I think with the Jack Daniels, I think it really is that minimum requirement that they're hitting. And then they're filling it with wheat. But I think it is a great everyday entry, again, gateway rye whiskey.
Okay, give me some Gateway Rye.
So the one I
Mitchell.
did want to talk to you guys about, this is a whiskey that I've been geeking out really hard since they released it. This is actually a newer distillery out of Texas.
That's it. That's it.
This is Balcones. This is their rye.
Yeah.
Super, super unique because they are using 100% rye in this bill. Now, we've talked about a few, obviously the requirements, whatnot. 100% of any single grain, not besides malted barley, because you've already malted it up, it's already been milled, is extremely hard to ferment. It's really hard for those individual enzymes within that one grain type to break open and break apart and separate themselves to be able to create a alcoholic wash for fermentation.
Okay.
I'm seeing some sour faces with the Jack. I'm seeing some
That's
good
not
faces
bad.
with it. I mean, this is kind of like watching
I think it's good.
right almost with everyone's facial expressions if they get on the board or not.
Mitchell, does the nose have some vanilla in it? It almost-
Absolutely.
Oh, okay.
Absolutely.
You're just
And again,
humoring
Jack
me,
uses
right?
Jack has their own rick house, so they do their own cooperage. So they're doing all their own barrels, and everything is brand new American white oak on that. So very porous oak. It adds a lot of expression to it, and that vanilla, it's extracted flavor compound. Technically, it's an aromatic, aroma compound that comes from the oak, and that is pretty much apparent in everything Jack Daniel's produces, in my opinion.
Mitchell, thoughts on Bullet Rye? I feel like that's a popular rye.
Yeah, Bullet as a whole is extremely popular. Bullet became Bullet by being able to, they were a sourced whiskey. So MGP out of Indiana, they're the ones who did majority of their distilling. I forget who owns them now. I want to say Beam owns them too now, but their rye again is to me on par with Jack Daniel's rye.
This is good.
Right on.
Please don't take my opinions as any, like, if you love that stuff, drink it. I'm not trying to convert anybody.
How about High West?
I like High West stuff a lot.
Yeah.
Their Renegade was always a good one.
What cheese do you put with the rye? Is it the Gouda?
Yeah, so the 3-year aged Gouda, the Clarina is what we suggested you pair with that. The Clarina could probably go with just about, except for maybe the Glenlivet, but it could probably go with just about any of these. It's super versatile. That cheese is out of Holland.
Good.
Yeah, it has an extremely nutty flavor and very unique in the sense that it has that like crystal, I don't want to use the term gritty because it's not gritty, but it has that like bite and crunch to it when you eat it. Yeah. And it just pairs so nicely with
Cheese and wine are quite alike.
cheese and wine are great, but I will say this one pairs really, really well with whiskeys. It's a very popular one for that. And it has lots of flavor. That cheese actually, it works out well that you guys are having it last because the longer it sits out, you can't leave it out all day, but the longer it sits out, about an hour, hour and a half after. So if you eat it right out of the fridge, it will taste different than if you let it sit on your counter for like 45 minutes to an hour. You'll get a different flavor profile. So now you guys are an hour and a half in since you've pulled it out. So you're getting that nice flavor, which will pair nicely. Whereas the aged cheddar that you probably started with is going to start getting that oily texture, when cheese starts to melt. Whereas this one is now hitting its stride.
So I'm drinking this rye on the screen. And again, I absolutely, if you like that spice, if you want some depth, and this has got chocolate, this has got leather, this is worth $40. If you go to Total Wine, you could get for 35 though.
Total Wine, apparently everyone is drinking whiskey right now in little mini bottles to make them feel better because finding 43, I think it's 43 kit, like mini bottles of everything.
We struggled hard.
I think I bought out Bevmo, both Fresno and Clovis and Total Wine to get enough Glenlivets for everyone. Finding enough of these was.
We're all working at home. How are people drinking the small bottle? Gosh dang it.
Yeah. But we
Save
didn't.
the liquor cabinet.
So one other thing before we move to the Canadian here, we don't have any Canadian whiskey to taste. I just wanted to talk about it. Everybody, I'm sure, has heard of wheated bourbon, high rye bourbon, any of that. So again, this is all kind of the trick of understanding what these labels mean. And I wanted to talk about this after the rye. So bourbon, 51% corn, correct? After that, you can use anything. So if you have a wheated bourbon like Weller, which is another one of those, should be a very daily consumable one, and now it's allocated. Anyway, it is a wheated bourbon. So the remaining 49%, the majority of that, there's no law of how much, but 49% to the majority of that next percentage is wheat versus high rye, 49% to whatever the majority math wise is rye. And that's how you can kind of change around and play with those other different flavor profiles versus, again, the Woodford 72, 73% corn, and then a couple other different grains in there. All right, Canadian whiskey. I have a fun little Fresno fact for you. 2018, Fresno City as a whole sold more Crown Royal than anywhere else in the state of California for that entire year.
Boy.
Get it.
We are proud.
Yeah.
Krispy Kreme too, don't forget.
I did my share of Crown, but not Krispy Kreme.
Yeah. I can't say anything because, when I first got in the restaurant business, after everybody got off, I swear Crown Royal was the only thing your friends that were bartending at the other bar would pour you. It was like, that was the unspoken rule, which when I moved out of Fresno and went to other places and truly learned that a bartender's handshake was Fernet, which was much better in my opinion. But it is what it is. So Canadian whiskey. So these guys, and by these guys, I mean the country, there's rules, but there's no rules as far as what you label them as. Canadian whiskey really became popular during Prohibition. I mean, everybody was floating that stuff across the Great Lakes, down to all the speakeasies. This is where they were getting it. And while they were doing it, because we were desperate to drink here in America, they got away with putting a lot of different stuff without putting it on the labels. And there's still some struggles and confusion with all that. The main one is Canadian rye. I'm sure everybody's seen on there, rye. If you see the word rye on a bottle of Canadian whiskey, there doesn't have to be a single drop of rye grain in that bottle of whiskey.
Really?
It can, but it does not have to have any. And that is just like one little key thing, that unfortunately is continued on to this day. I mean, they've regulated a lot more, but as far as just their inner company standards, but yeah, legally they don't have to put anything in there. They could put it on there. But and the reason why it kind of just became, again, Pennsylvania and everything, they were growing rye, and they're, that was kind of what they wanted. Prohibition hit, and so when these Canadians were hearing, hey, we want rye whiskey, they just put it on the label. But luckily, again, for them, they've been able to keep chugging and kill it since, aging wise, no less than 3 years. That's pretty standard across most of the other world. Only in the US really do we have that 2 year minimum. You go to Japanese whiskey, you go to Scotch, Ireland, it's all about 3 years mostly. But again, Canadian whiskey, huge market. There's a ton of really cool stuff. And obviously our Crown Royal is huge too, but try some of these other bottlings because there's some really cool whiskeys out there now coming out of Canada.
So Mitchell, if they don't use rye, what are they actually using?
Malted barley is the dominant, or just your corn, your wheat, any other grain types that they can get a hold of. Again, there can be rye in there, and a lot of them are truly putting rye in there on the bottle. But you look at, again, not trying to offend anybody. You look at like Canadian Mist or like, Canadian Club or any of those kind of things that have rye on those. They might now, but I can guarantee it, even all the way up into early 2000s, they did not. They had whatever grains they could absolutely get to ferment and put in that bottle.
Don't come for my CC, Mitchell.
Beg your pardon?
Don't come for my CC, my Canadian Club.
Again, the only reason why I can even vouch on those is after talking to some of these guys that have been in the industry longer than I've been alive and hearing some of their war stories from the late 80s and the 90s. It's wild what like to have people truly back up what the rumors and all these things that you read about. It's just next level.
Did you finish this, Scott?
So that's the end of my slideshow, but I definitely want questions. If hopefully again I didn't upset anybody by calling out anybody's brand. I hit very wide strokes on everything because there's just so much.
What is the best mixer in terms of sodas, like club soda, 7-Up, or Coca-Cola with any of these alcohols, these whiskeys?
What are you looking for?
Well, I just want to know if you're going to serve a drink to someone, is it what they choose to have, or do you need to ask them?
I always, when I was bartending, I 100% ask it. If they wanted something on to mix with it, I would absolutely ask, because club soda versus Coke versus tonic, all completely different flavors. True story, no joke. Again, talking about Pappy Van Winkle, which is very expensive and very rare. I was bartending and I had a customer one time come in, ask me for Pappy 23 on Coke.
Oof.
And
God.
I personally would have died if I had poured that for him. So what I did, and he insisted, so I poured him a shot of his Pappy 23 neat and I gave him a Coke on the side. I was like, you can do this on your own time, but I'm not going to do that. That's the only time I've ever not given a customer their request. But I gave it to him. I just didn't do the mixing. So again, like if you're looking for whiskey soda, you're basically, that soda is just going to kind of lighten it up a little bit. You're just going to add some bubbles. You're carbonating it. It's normally over ice, or you're chilling it down. Just depends on if you just want it. I mean, I drink some whiskey sodas during the summertime just to have that whiskey flavor, but I don't want neat whiskey because it's hot outside. Mm-hmm. If I'm drinking, I don't drink soda anymore, so I don't do Coke. But again, if people are wanting to drink whiskey and mask it with sugar, that's what they'll drink. Yeah, that's the most politically correct answer I guess I have for that.
Okay, thank you.
Don't knock that. Some people don't want to taste the alcohol.
Again, masking with sugar.
And an umbrella.
What's your personal preference sipping whiskey straight?
Say that one more time.
Is your personal preference to just sip whiskey straight?
Me personally, yes, absolutely. If I, again, this, I like studying and I like seeing what a whiskey will give me. So I'll play with it with the water. But unless, again, it's a hot day and I can't get my hands on any gin, I'll do whiskey and soda on the rocks. But yeah, most time I'll do it straight. Again, just going into Toller or Bevmo, it's really fun to just pull, just 2 or 3 different scotches or Irish and just kind of taste them side by side, because then you're really able to see, each one of these distilleries has a recipe. And so to see how those recipes really change and vary, I mean, I probably have 70 or 80 bottles of whiskey at my house that are all maybe like only 2 fingers open, because I just randomly will go through and just systematically keep tasting. The fiance hates it because she's like, when is this getting out of my house? But it is where it is.
Mitchell,
Earlier
the fiance.
Say what?
The fiance, Mitchell.
The fiance, yeah. If the state ever allows us to get married.
Earlier,
Do you have a go-to Japanese whiskey?
Nika for sure is my go-to Japanese whiskey. Absolutely killer. They're one of the oldest distilleries in Japan. They've got 2 facilities that they actually really pull from as far as their grain sources and their distilling process. Yoshia in the south, and I can't pronounce it, but there's one in the north as well. I actually got the opportunity a couple weeks ago to taste some of their 100-year anniversary side by side, and that was pretty life-changing.
Nice.
Ray, you had a question. I saw you start to go.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier that this Glenlivet was kind of a gateway into the single malts. What
Yeah.
labels would you consider 2 and 3 rungs above? I mean, there's Glenmorangie, Glenfiddich, everything. So where would you go from here?
Like Glenfiddich.
Oh, if I really was trying to just understand, I guess, age statements, I would stick with Glenlivet and try some of their more progressed age statements just to kind of understand.
Glenfiddich.
But, oh, that's a tough one. I am a big fan of Glenlivet, but I mean, I like Macallan's stuff too. I guess ultimately the biggest thing in Gateway, when I meant that, is more, it's the gateway as far as the peat status, like how peaty it is. From there, I would then start playing with like Lagavulin 16 or Arbor 10, like that from, the Isla or lowland areas. That way you can really see like how peat really is, that more peat influence is really adding to the whiskey.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Judy, I see your hand up.
Thank you. So suppose I were having people over and we were just doing some whiskey tasting. Besides cheese, what else could I put out there? We put sourdough and some dipping oils and stuff like that, but what else could you put out there?
Nuts are always great. Obviously, like that salt is going to hit a little differently depending on what the alcohol is, versus like your cashews, your almonds texturally are always great. I honestly really do like dried meats.
Okay, so we put salami out there tonight. Okay.
Yeah, so if you've got your salami versus your prosciutto versus whatever.
Mortadella.
Yeah, dried meats are always pretty crazy. This is going to be definitely a left field for it, but different kind of varietal raisins, chocolate covered raisins, are really, really cool. They don't have to be chocolate covered. That's just kind of if you need a sweet tooth in your life. But the raisin, you've already got that concentrated, basically dried out sugars in there from, in those figgy flavors. But dried raisins, any kind of dried fruit, actually are just really cool to taste with whiskeys.
Okay, thank you.
You go Google any kind of like primo charcuterie board, and that's like your go-to for whiskey tasting.
Oh, okay.
For Scotch, when you guys had the Glenlivet and we mentioned the blue cheese, dried figs with blue cheese would be a fantastic pairing. You put the blue cheese on top of the dried fig, that with a Scotch would probably be really, really good.
That sounds real good.
Mitchell?
Yeah.
I understand that alcohol kills COVID-19. How much would you recommend drinking every night to be safe?
I think it was 2 classes ago, I told everybody that I'm a firm believer in maintaining a 0.2 ABV in my bloodstream. Because, like you said, I'm a firm believer that, a Purell, shoot, if you're supposed to put that on your hands and sanitizes, why can't I have it through my blood? And again, that 0.2, it's perfect. You're 0.02, you're just kind of floating, but you're not like floating. It's easier said than done. I work in the alcohol industry, so I can get away with it. But if you're working from home, just depends on how big you want your smile on your Zoom calls.
Thank you.
Anybody else have any other questions? How did you guys enjoy tonight? Did you guys have a favorite that you guys tried, or a favorite flavor profile? Cheeses that you liked? What did we enjoy?
I liked all your cheese picks, Brittany. They were great. Good job.
Yeah, your cheese picks were great. I love the brie, but I like the rest of it too.
And I didn't think I liked Scotch, but you had one that wasn't all smoky peaty, and I really liked it. Yeah.
The quince paste was amazing.
Yeah, the membrillo is like in some ways I say it's life changing. You can put that membrillo with maybe not the cheddar, but the rest of them on the plate. You can put the membrillo with the brie, with the Gouda, and I feel like it like changes the flavor of it. You can buy it online. I think you can still do it through Amazon. Whole Foods has it. I don't think Trader Joe's does. It comes in like a brick. And you take a really thin slice of it. And then I usually will cut it in like thirds or fourths because you don't need a ton, but it is a very specific thing. It's amazing. And with manchegos, it's really, really wonderful. But that's what it's made for. But yeah, you either have to know someone who makes it. I was telling Mitchell earlier, you have to know someone who makes it. You have to be willing to drive to Whole Foods or spend a lot of money buying it online. Okay. But Whole Foods just carry it. I want to say it's like $6 or $8 a brick, which will last you a little while. Oh man, something fell in my other room. My husband's in the other room with the kids, so I'm assuming something fell over.
Did you leave the scotch with him?
No. But see, Mitchell jokes that, you know, people who want to drink their whiskey with Coke, that is me. If I'm going to drink it, it's going to be a whiskey sour. That's how I take it. No, I don't leave it.
Again, it's everyone's personal preference.
I will say, if you guys haven't tried it, interestingly enough, it's great for the summertime. Jameson now makes, it's called Jameson Cold Brew, which is coffee, got the coffee. That on ice, when it's warm, it's really, like warm out is really, really nice. I'll drink that plain.
Brittany, which cheese was it that was the hard cheese that like almost Parmesan?
So that is the 3-year aged, that's the Gouda. That's the 3-year aged Gouda.
Trader Joe's it reminded me of this cheese that we buy all the time called, it's their brand Unexpected Cheddar. Have you ever tried that one? It's like, it has those little crystals in it too.
Yeah, so it's a similar, they do it the same way with the aging process. So when you age cheese, whether that, not usually with sheep, but with cow's milk, when you age cheese, the longer you let it age, the more crystals will form. And that's basically the fat content in it crystallizing. I don't think you guys can see it. When you cut, when you get a wedge of the cheese and you cut it, you'll almost see, and people freak out. My husband did when he first got married to me and got to experience cheeses. He's like, there's mold in the cheese. And I'm like, I know, we paid more money for that. And he was like, but there's mold in the cheese. I said, it's 3-year-old cheese. Of course there's mold in it. But it's that mold and the fat coming together. And that's what makes that real crunchy, crystallized texture. And that comes about kind of because your cheese is drying out. The longer it ages, the more it's going to dry out. And then it really starts to concentrate the flavor. So that's why like your Parmesans, you really have that punch of flavor. You don't need as much of it than like a yellow cheddar cheese. It's like the difference between like a mild cheddar versus a sharp cheddar. You know, it's the longer you let it go, the bigger the flavor, the less you need. And the Gouda that you guys have, that should be sliced either with a cheese slicer, like the planers, or how you guys had it where it was like a thinner slice that's kind of like break apart and crumble. That's how you get the best flavor. You don't want to like cube it up because you want to give as much surface area for it to warm, to open up the pores and really give you the good flavor. So certain cheeses you cut in cubes, other cheeses you don't cut in cubes. Manchego, you don't want to cube. If you go to someone's house and they cube your Manchego, don't eat it. They don't know what they're doing. Don't cube your Manchego. Don't cube your Manchego.
Just leave.
Just be like, oh, you're one of those people.
Back out the door.
Mitchell's a whiskey and a wine snob. I'm a cheese snob. Want to impress me, you buy me cheese.
Okay.
So if you ever have cheese questions, I'm happy to help. It's my jam. But does anyone have other questions for Mitchell? Otherwise, I'm going to stop the recording.
I have one more quick question for Mitchell. I would like to know what part of the United States makes most of the American liquor? Or
American whiskey.
yes.
I'm willing. I think the TTB. It was like 80 to 85% of all whiskey is still coming out of the Kentucky region, for the most part. I was listening to a podcast the other day. They were saying that there's probably about 7 million barrels of whiskey aging in the state of Kentucky, which is more than the population of Kentucky.
That's a good state.
Which I think they've got it together. But I mean, honestly, there's whiskey and liquor and other spirits made all over the United States. California is really making its run on things. I mean, you've got St. George right up here in Alameda that does a great job with a lot of stuff. You've got Charbet up in Sonoma that's doing all sorts of wild whiskeys. They legit make beer, like a lager, a Kolsch, or whatever, and then they distill that. They don't just make what, beer as we call like distilling beer or anything like that. They are making legit beer and then distilling it and creating just sensational whiskeys. Tennessee, obviously. And I didn't really even touch base on like Tennessee whiskey, which essentially to be labeled Tennessee whiskey is for all intents and bourbon, but you also have an additional charcoal filtering on top of that. There's good stuff out of every state.
All right. Thank you so much, Mitchell. Very informative.
My pleasure. I hope I answered enough questions.
Thank you. You did good.
Mitchell, I have a question. One last question. Total Wine recommended been wanting to try a Japanese whiskey. And are you familiar with Hibiki?
Yes, I am. Very much so.
So like the smoke on the back end, is there anything else you would recommend that has a little smoke to it, but not up front, that it's just so smoky right away when you take a sip?
In Japanese whiskey wise?
And not necessarily Japanese.
So you want just a little bit of that smoke, but not a ton?
Yeah.
On a Scotch side, I would say any of the Highland Park Scotches. They definitely use a little bit more new oak. So you get a little bit more of those kind of caramel notes. And with the peat on the backside, it's definitely a lot more of an aromatic versus a peat reek, as they say. Let's see. To me, if you want to do Japanese whiskey, I would try the Nika coffee. And that's not coffee grains or anything. That is the type of still that they're using.
Okay.
And that is a little bit more of a rich style of whiskey as well. And Japanese whiskey is very much based and mimicked off Scotch. And that is actually because the founder of Nika married one of the princesses of Scotland back 100-something years ago and brought that trade into each other.
Okay.
I just honestly try anything and everything. If you have a budget, of say, I only want to spend $20 on whiskey, just kind of run through and see what kind of whiskeys you can get for $20. And ultimately your guys' cabinets are going to look like mine.
Can you hold up that Kirkland bottle that you showed?
Yeah, honestly, this is probably one of the best things Costco's ever made. They have a 22, a 23, and a 25 year.
Wow.
They're very hard to find, but again, this 22 year only cost me $70.
Wow.
Versus this exact same bottling that doesn't say Kirkland on it, but it's made by the same independent bottler that their bottles are literally stamped on, is $280. So
wow.
Sometimes you got to go for economics. And that's how you try things, right? When you look at things a little bit more economically.
How about the Kirkland Irish? Have you tried that?
I haven't had a chance to try that one yet. To be 100%, I am not a huge Irish whiskey guy. I enjoy them, but if I'm going to spend money, most times it's either on Scotch or American whiskey.
Okay.
So I have a fun fact about Irish hooch, the Poynton, and it was started, they always have made it, but during the Troubles, the time of the Troubles, there were a lot of widows. And so it became the place where it was made was by the widows. And so, yeah. And so all through the Troubles, and then it carried on. So most of the time, if you were going to get, you know, that kind of rock gut stuff, it would be made by your grandma. But but it was made by the
Interesting.
widows.
Or your neighbor's grandma that was
Or your
selling you
neighbor's
the
grandma.
rock gut.
But it was made by the widows. It was what they gave them to make a living. Is you get to make that.
Interesting. That is something I've actually never read and never heard before. So that is very.
I'm a fan of Irish history, but that's
Yeah,
That's
I'm a
extremely
fan of
cool.
Irish whiskey.
No, that's fantastic. That's super cool. Okay. I mean, yeah, unless anybody else has, I'm probably going to sign off and go pour myself another 2 or 3 drams.
Well, perfect. I'm gonna stop the recording.